This morning, I would like to begin by directing your thought to two distinct areas of thought that on the face may seem like they're not completely related, but we will make that connection, and that will be the basis of the message this morning. The first area of thought is military generals. And the question is, who are the best military minds of all time? I think that the average person might be hard-pressed to think of more than maybe 2, 3, or 4 names. But that's what we have the internet for nowadays, too. So I did a net search this past week, and it jogged my memory, some names I had come across in the past. Names like Napoleon, and Hannibal, and Alexander the Great, and Julius Caesar, Genghis Khan. More recently, 20th century, General George Patton is listed among the greatest ever. Even in the Bible, David was a great military man. He was described as a man of war. Now, set aside military minds for the time being. Now think about traitors, people who betray other people. Obviously, biblically, you'd think of Judas, but another name, the first name outside of the Bible that came to my mind was Benedict Arnold. I knew Benedict Arnold is associated with being a traitor, but I really didn't know a whole lot about him. So I looked him up, and it turns out he was a military officer under President George Washington. Sort of give you an idea where he is historically, like late 1700s, early 1800s. But Benedict had was upset, being passed over for promotion after promotion, and a number of other things happened in his life that basically hurt his feelings and turned him sour against the newly formed United States. He was so upset that in 1780 he defected over to the British. And they were the ones, of course, who the Americans were fighting for our independence. Therefore, Benedict Arnold got labeled a traitor. And it's interesting historical irony here with the story of Benedict Arnold. His betrayal may have actually been the shot in the arm that the Americans needed to win the Revolutionary War. Because, as you know, military conflicts, you have your highs and your lows. And they tended to be in a low at that time. A lot of people were losing support for the war effort. But once they found out that this man, Benedict Arnold, had betrayed the United States, then that was really what they needed. They were all in to support the war effort, and the rest is history. To this day, Benedict Arnold's name is synonymous with the word traitor. Just a few years ago, I remember basketball player LeBron James. He had moved from one team to the other. And I remember seeing on TV fans at his old team holding signs saying Benedict James. Now it's a little bit of a stretch to say he's exactly like Benedict Arnold, but the idea is they thought he had betrayed them and went to another team. So Benedict Arnold's name just brings those kind of feelings to mind. And it was actually Ben Franklin who lived around the time of George Washington and Benedict Arnold. He compared Judas Iscariot in the Bible to Benedict Arnold, and Ben Franklin made an interesting statement. He said, Judas only sold 1 man, but Benedict Arnold sold 3 million. It's an interesting way to look at it, and very true. In this passage we're going to look at this morning, you have a man named Ahithophel. Okay, odd name. He could be described as both a great military mind and a traitor. He's both rolled into one. He's like Alexander the Great meets George Patton. Maybe he possibly could have been even more of a traitor than Benedict Arnold, depending on your perspective. I don't think it is an exaggeration to call Ahithophel the Judas of the Old Testament. And we'll see why this morning. We'll get to it by looking at our passage, which looks a little confusing up there on the screen, but 2 Samuel 16:23 is simply the last verse of one chapter. Read the 14th verse of the next chapter, and then we'll have a postscript verse to tell us what happens to this man named Ahithophel. So we'll begin reading the scriptures that are on the screen. Now in those days, the advice Ahithophel gave was like that of one who inquires of God. That was how both David and Absalom regarded all of Ahithophel's advice. Ahithophel said to Absalom, I would choose 12,000 men and set out tonight in pursuit of David. I would attack him while he is weary and weak. I would strike him with terror, and then all the people with him will flee. I would strike down only the king and bring all the people back to you. The death of the man you seek will mean the return of all. All the people will be unharmed. This plan seemed good to Absalom and to all the elders of Israel. But Absalom said, summon also Hushai the Archite, so we can hear what he has to say as well. When Hushai came to him, Absalom said, Ahithophel has given this advice. Should we do what he says? If not, give us your opinion. Hushai replied to Absalom, the advice Ahithophel has given is not good at this time. You know your father and his men. They are fighters, and as fierce as a wild bear robbed of her cubs. Besides, your father's an experienced fighter. He will not spend the night with the troops. Even now he's hidden in a cave or some other place. If he should attack your troops first, whoever hears about it will say there has been a slaughter among the troops who follow Absalom. Then even the bravest soldier, whose heart is like the heart of a lion, will melt with fear. For all Israel knows that your father is a fighter, and that those with him are brave. So I advise you, let all Israel from Dan to Beersheba, as numerous as the sand on the seashore, be gathered to you, with you yourself leading them into battle. Then we will attack him wherever he may be found, and we will fall on him as dew settles on the ground. Neither he or any of his men will be left alive. If he withdraws into a city, then all Israel will bring ropes to that city, and we will drag it down to the valley until not so much as a pebble is left. Absalom and all the men of Israel said, the advice of Hushai the Archite is better than that of Ahithophel. For the Lord had determined to frustrate the good advice of Ahithophel in order to bring disaster on Absalom. And then we'll just move up about 9 verses. This is what happened. When Ahithophel saw that his advice had not been followed, he saddled his donkey and set out for his house in his hometown. He put his house in order and then hanged himself. So he died and was buried in his father's tomb. May the Lord's blessing be added to the reading and hearing of his holy word. This part of David's life takes up several chapters here, but it's necessary to give a certain amount of detail in order to illustrate the sovereign authority of God over everything that's happening. What happened is that back in chapter 15, David's fleeing from Jerusalem. We talked about that before, fleeing in disgrace. And many of his people were removing their support. He only had a few true followers with him as he's leaving the capital city. But a few followers remained. Among them was a man named Hushai, who we talked about in our passage this morning. David goes and sends Hushai on a covert mission to thwart the plans of Absalom by giving him either bad advice or at least advice that's going to buy David some precious time in order for him to levy an appropriate defense. Then in chapter 16, Hushai appears to Absalom, pledges his allegiance to him, and so he gains favor with him. And this is the competing regime now. Again, he's like an undercover agent. Then we go to chapter 17, and we find this guy who's like George Patton and Benedict Arnold all rolled up together. His name's Ahithophel. He's the guy that just a minute ago I said is like Judas of the Old Testament. I had to include that last verse of chapter 16 to begin it this morning to show you how highly regarded this man was. It says, now in those days, the advice of Ahithophel that Ahithophel gave was like that of one who inquires of God. So in other words, when this guy spoke, people listened and they obeyed. It's more or less they're thinking, this guy is so wise, he has to be connected and in tune with God, so we got to do what he says. And it sets the scene the stage for a scene that really is nothing short of miraculous. We may not notice it when we read it first, but when we break it down, what's happening is Absalom gets military advice from the wise Ahithophel, who tells him, attack David quickly and directly because David is on the run. He can't put up a proper defense. And the text leads us to believe that would have been the better, tack to take for Absalom. However, Absalom knew that Hushai was an advisor of David in the past, so he asked him what his take is. And first of all, the fact that Absalom even asked for a second opinion after hearing from the wise Ahithophel is mind-boggling and completely miraculous in and of itself. Football season's here, okay, woohoo. And here's a football analogy for you, okay? This is what it was like. It's like back in the day, if you are a football coach and if you needed advice in a crucial part of the game, what play should I run? And if you, for some reason, were able to get Vince Lombardi on the phone, the great Green Bay Packer head coach, one of the greatest ever, ask him to call a play, he tells you what play he would run. Why would you then go and ask anybody else? You've already heard from the greatest, okay? Instead of taking Vince Lombardi's advice, you then pick up the phone and ask my mom what play she would run. No offense to my mom, she understands football, but I mean, she's not reading defenses and stuff like that. That's pretty much what we're looking at here, the difference between Hushai and Ahithophel. Not only was it a miracle that Absalom even sought a second opinion, but what's even more miraculous is he didn't take his advice either. Why not? Well, look at what Hushai says. Listen to his words. Let all Israel be gathered to you, with you yourself leading them into battle. I think the biggest reason is because Hushai was appealing to Absalom's sense of vanity. You be the one to lead them to victory. You be the great king who's going to overthrow the great David. It's like, and the Bible tells us Absalom was a very good-looking man, just like his father. So it's like Hushai saying, everyone knows, first of all, hey, you're good-looking, you got that going for you. Use that to your advantage. This is your big moment. Don't do it in secret. Let everybody see how great you are. Lead a massive army, and you'll show your father David how everyone is behind you, and they've rejected him. Hushai appealed to Absalom's self-centeredness. And it appealed to him so much that he rejected and ignored the wisest advice that he could in order to be the top dog. That's the strength of vanity. That's what vanity can do for a person. Make you make bad decisions because your focus has shifted to exalting yourself rather than accomplishing the goal you've set out to do. Another point we shouldn't ignore is that last week we read that David prayed that Ahithophel's advice would not be heeded. This is a spiritual battle going on as well. And behind the scenes, we don't see this stuff going on. But listen to this. David's humble prayer was much stronger than the decision of a vain enemy. That's exactly why we can't be lax in our prayer life. We don't know what God may be working out, and prayer focuses our mind on God. David realized the situation was out of his hands now. As we say, all you can do is pray. That's all that he was able to do. He put his faith in God that he would work something out and bring a proper result. So when we pray, we prove to God that we are aligned with his will, just as David did. Moving on to the second point is that when you read this section of the Bible, you ask yourself, why did Ahithophel do what he did? Why did he betray David? Why did he go and defect to Absalom? Well, I wish I could point to a verse here that specifically spells it out for us, but you'd be hard-pressed to find it. And I would I would be likely to do something like this. I would say to someone who isn't in the habit of reading their Bible on a daily basis, I would suggest start at Genesis 1 and start reading the Bible, and you can stop reading whenever you find out why Ahithophel did this. And then once I've tricked you into reading the whole Bible, then we can talk about why it doesn't have that in there. All we have to do is consider what we do know and take it from there. See, does anything make sense? For one thing, we know Ahithophel was a very trusted advisor of David. Something else that's interesting is Ahithophel had a granddaughter. Okay? And I find it especially interesting that we know the Bible doesn't always provide names, especially female names. Some it does, but not many. It does in this case. And you know who his granddaughter was? Is Bathsheba. Found that very interesting. Well, okay, what's the big deal? His granddaughter's Bathsheba. Well, first of all, I'm a very inquisitive person, note taker. If you're interested, look up those two verses. That puts it together. It says who Bathsheba's father is, and then the other one says that her father was Ahithophel. So, this is sort of where you can cue that suspenseful music. Dun, 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 dun. All right. First of all, it explains why Bathsheba was bathing so close to the palace. You want to, know that. David spied her then because her husband, her father, and her grandfather are all in David's inner circle. So they certainly had to live close by. And here's something else. Just think in your minds today what this says about David and how far he had fallen whenever he saw her. That he pursued her in spite of knowing her relationship to her husband Uriah and her father and her grandfather. Yet David still went for it. One thing it tells me is David did some very terrible things, but it also tells us that he still maintained the faith throughout all of it. Secondly, we can only speculate on this point too, but I would suggest if I had a granddaughter who was pursued by a man like David, and he got her pregnant, and he was responsible for the death of her husband, and if he was responsible for the death of her baby, how would I feel towards David? All I can say is if I weren't a Christian, I would want him to pay. Maybe that's what's happening here. And especially if I were as highly regarded and influential as Ahithophel was, I would realize I can probably do something to make this happen too. So I think it's quite possible he held a grudge against David for his relations with Bathsheba and everything that happened as a result of that. I think Ahithophel did not forgive David as he should have, and I think he was simply determined to make him pay. So he defected to the other side and tried to defeat him. Knowing that, imagine what it did to Ahithophel when Absalom goes and rejects his wise advice. This probably, I would say, is the first time in his life, most likely, that his advice wasn't taken. So he certainly felt rejected, and he was wise enough to realize that when Absalom took Hushai's advice instead, it was pretty much over. He knew that was a plan that was going to fail. It was terrible advice because the time to attack David was when he was weak and on the run and unable to defend himself properly. As far as Ahithophel was concerned, the only thing left to do was to get his house in order and then kill himself, sadly. What's legal punishment for traitors? Death penalty. So just like Benedict Arnold, although his story's odd, and I won't get into that. He just wasn't going to put his family and himself through all that would happen. This is Ahithophel we're talking about. Handwriting's on the wall, so he said, I'm just going to do the deed myself and be done with it. And that leads to the final point this morning, is that I want to look a little bit at how this man Ahithophel is similar to Judas Iscariot in the New Testament. There are many similarities, but I'll just name a few for them. First of all, they were both very highly trusted by those close to them. Judas was trusted so much he was given possession of the money bag. We know that didn't work out too well. And I think that's why nowadays you got to be careful with accountants too. You know, they can be pretty shady people. Another thing is that both of them thought they were following the wrong kind of king. Ahithophel certainly was upset at David's sin that was now made public by that time. So he probably wanted a better king than David, a king that didn't hurt his family as well. Judas, on the other hand, was with the majority at the time who wanted a Messiah who was going to deliver them immediately from the heavy-handed Roman rule. Both Ahithophel and Judas wanted their king to benefit them in the short term. Furthermore, both of them refused God's grace in their lives. There's no evidence that either of them repented or asked forgiveness, asked for God's grace for what they had done. And that leads to one more similarity, in that they both hanged themselves. They both died in the same exact way, hanged suicide. Ahithophel did it because he knew his treason was going to be exposed. Judas did it because his treason had already been exposed to some individuals already. They were basically both cut out of the same cloth, as they say. I could even go further with the similarities, but all it does is confirm the fact that people like these individuals, they seek to serve themselves first before anything else. The real shame is that in both of these cases, God set them up in positions where they could thrive and serve Him in great ways. Yet they both chose to be like Frank Sinatra, and I'll do it my way. What's even more interesting is that both of them spent a lot of their time with Christians. Yet, what effect did that have on them? Not much, apparently. They weren't impacted by their relationship with other Christians much at all to change their lives. Instead of following God, they decided to undermine God's plan. Now, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to influence people. We certainly should. What it means is that we are not responsible if someone else rejects Christ. All we can do is be a positive influence and live every day the way that God wants us to live and to follow Him. Look at Judas especially. He hung out with Jesus virtually every day for 3 years. He saw miracles, did amazing things. Yet, it wasn't enough to convert him. So we shouldn't take it personally whenever those close to us reject the faith either. We aren't going to blame Jesus because Judas didn't become a Christian. Who knows what individuals in your lives could be like Judas or Ahithophel? I've heard many stories about people going to church year after year, and they get involved and they're high-ranking even, some people in church, and they're not even saved. It's at some point later the light bulb finally goes off and they realize what this is all about. They realize Jesus paid the sin debt for them. In a moment time, you can go from traitor to disciple, just like that. If you don't have saving faith in Jesus Christ, and as far as God's concerned, you are a traitor to Him because He created all of us to worship Him, and anyone who refuses to do that has betrayed their Heavenly Father. Accepting Jesus into your life, on the other hand, does many things. It acknowledges we are not perfect. It proves that you know who God really is because He revealed Himself through Jesus. And it proves that you accept Jesus as the Lord of your life. And it also acknowledges that at one time you rejected Jesus, but now you've changed your life. You have converted, and now you're living for Him, and you're eager to do the things He's planned for you to do. So this morning I'd just like to leave you with a perspective on God's sovereignty. David is not a major player in this chapter that we read. although this chapter is very key in David's life. That's because God's frame of reference is so much larger than what we see. David simply uttered a prayer in an earlier chapter, and then we read about what all of these other people did as a response to bring about a resolution to that prayer. If you're here today dealing with some kind of issue in your life, I would suggest first, pray to God and pray in His will. If you haven't done that, don't expect anything else to work out. You got to do first things first. Once you pray, listen to God. Does He give you instructions? While you're waiting, and He may not give you instructions at all, so you may be waiting a long time. While you're waiting, continue to do the other work He's called you to do. Life doesn't have a pause button that we push whenever we need something from God. We need to continue to work because there is an awful lot to do. And while you're waiting, don't sit around worrying about what you have prayed about, what you've already taken to God in prayer. Because the Bible says you can't add 1 cubit to your life or 1 hour to your life by worrying. It's in God's hands. So what good is our worrying going to do? And if anyone here really isn't dealing with a major issue right now, then God bless you. We're thankful for that. But you still need to be obedient to God, because we don't know if He's working out a resolution to someone else's issue through us. Just quite possible. That's what Hushai did when he was obedient to David, and his obedience changed the course of many lives. So no matter if you realize it or not, the good chance is right now your life is influencing someone's life, and maybe it's influencing the life of a person you've never even met, and maybe you never will meet them. God is sovereign. His plan will work out in the end. So if I were you, I would much rather be a part of God's plan, like Hushai was, rather than be like Absalom, who was acting against God's plan in vain. Let's bow our heads and we'll close out with a word of prayer.